Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." He answered them, "And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God commanded, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, 'If anyone tells his father or his mother, what would you have gained from me is given to God, he need not honor his father.' So for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy. Let me read that again. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of man.' And he called the people to him and said to them, 'Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person.' Then the disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?' He answered, 'Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit.' But Peter said to him, 'Explain the parable to us.' And he said, 'Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." And this is God's word.
Some of the staff were having a little chat this week. I think it was at lunchtime or something. And someone made a comment about one of the good things that came out of the COVID period. That was not a great time. We don't want to go back there. But one of the good things was the fact that life was less busy, which is true. But it got me thinking that there was another possible good thing that came out of the COVID time was the renewed attention that people paid to personal hygiene, and especially to the washing of hands in particular. Now, confession time, this may be TMI for a Sunday morning, but I was not, shall we say, particularly well known for being a person who paid lots of attention to personal hygiene. Who was really careful when it came to the washing of hands. No surprise to my wife, but maybe that's news to you. And I felt bad about that and still do rightly so. But what helped me a little while ago is realized I'm not the only guy. Right? I mean, I watched a little stand-up thing, Trevor Noah recently, who was comparing bathroom habits of men and women, and one of the comparisons he made is how men, seems to be universally, will do just enough to make it look like they've washed their hands after they've gone to the bathroom. So like just other guys in the bathroom, just like open the tap, like don't even put your hands, just like make sure it gets heard that there's rushing water. Maybe when you walk past the dryer, just skim your hand under the dryer and everyone's like, oh yeah, okay, that guy washed his hands, but every single guy is just doing the same thing. I'm happy to tell you, this has all dramatically changed in my life, okay? Just so you know, don't need to worry about me anymore, partly COVID, partly a wife who cares about me and things like this. Now, you might be wondering why I'm opening a sermon talking about bathroom habits. And just a heads up, it is going to come up again, so it's there. But mainly because our text today starts with an interrogation of Jesus by a group of religious leaders all about the washing of hands before eating. So the passage opens, if you missed it, with some Pharisees and some scribes who approach Jesus, and we read that they are from Jerusalem. Now, Jesus and his disciples are still in the Galilee region, so they've come a long way, and coming from Jerusalem, we deduce that this is an official delegation that is sent to investigate this person of Jesus. And so their opening accusation, if you like, against Jesus is this: why don't your disciples wash their hands before eating? Now, unlike my little story in the beginning, this that they're referring to, the washing of hands before eating, has nothing to do with personal hygiene, although that is a good thing, but that's not what they are referencing here. This is all about religious ritual. So now let me take some time to just unpack this, what was going on, not just because it's interesting, it is, but because it's going to become important as we get to the meat of where our text is. So by the time of Jesus, there was within Judaism, Jewish belief, a very comprehensive and very well-developed system of what we call and they called oral law. Oral law, in other words, laws or traditions that had been transmitted orally, different to the written law. So accepted that there is the written law of God, given by God, encapsulated in the scriptures, which are our same Old Testament scriptures. So there is the written law, which is the commandments of God, but then there is also this oral law that had developed. Tradition says that this oral law, and I mean seriously comprehensive and well established by the time of Jesus, tradition says it originated all the way back at the time of Moses, actually. So as he's receiving written law, there were also discussions around what this law meant and how to keep it. It doesn't seem that that's likely to be entirely true. It seems that most of it took shape just after the exile of Israel to Babylon. So you remember that most catastrophic event in the Old Testament, God's punishment of his people for breaking his commandments. And so after the exile and the temple is destroyed, religious leaders are rising up, and as they go back to God's land, start thinking about reflecting on this tragedy that occurred because of breaking the commandments of God, and so started to talk about how it is that the religious community, they were just determined that this would never happen again, which is really good, right? Like that is a positive reflection to make sure that the commandments of God don't get broken again, so that this tragedy doesn't happen again. And the way that they did that was, here's the commandments of God, and so developed traditions or their own commandments to help them not break the commandments of God. And I think the way that I've been thinking about this just recently, for me, let's say as parents, we are giving our children commandments for their own benefit, which is what the commandments of God are like. And so up till December, our kids, 5 and 7, didn't know how to swim. And so that was like a serious stress for me. And December, wonderful, they could swim. But imagine then as parents, for their own protection, we would give this commandment to never get into the pool without an adult present. I mean, that makes sense, right? That's a good commandment. But perhaps because out of fear that this is so serious, we might add on top of that another commandment or rule in the household. You're never allowed to go into the back garden, right? Because the pool's in the back garden. And so it just seems like, yeah, that would make sense. It's less likely that they're going to get into the pool if the rule is they don't get into the back garden. That's kind of what this oral law was like. Thousands of other commandments not given by God. So interpreted by men, not yet fully written down by the time of Jesus. It would take hundreds of years before it was written down. It is written down today. You can go and read that. But all of these traditions, or what was known as the oral law, initially at least made with the purpose of helping God's people not break the actual written law. So by the time of Jesus, this was established, and so there were thousands of these commandments, not from God, but from man, and a large portion of them, like a large section in this oral law was dedicated to rules about the washing of hands. very detailed rules about how one should wash their hands before the meal. So just notice, this is not written law. God never commanded that people wash their hands in this way before they eat, but this was their tradition, very detailed. For example, you can't just wash your hands in a basin. It had to be running water. The water had to run up to your wrist. And so you'll even see that today. In Israel, strict Jewish observers would practice this today. Now, the reason that this oral law developed around the ritual washing of hands, again, had nothing to do with hygiene, had to do with what is a very biblical, really big biblical idea of what is considered clean and unclean. And of course, when I say clean and unclean, I don't mean dirty and then washed as in bath. I mean other synonyms would be defiled or undefiled, or impure versus pure. These are what's the word I'm trying to say? These are, hey? Synonyms, thank you. Zwei, synonyms. That's why he's in the front row, the wise man. Synonyms for these commandments about this ritual washing of hands. Now, we came across this idea of ritual impurity in Matthew chapter 9, which was just the other day, right? So you remember it, hey? It was just like, it was a long time ago. So if you don't remember it, I'll remind you. This was a story of Jesus encountering a woman who had an unusual blood discharge for about 12 years, and how she approaches Jesus and grabs onto his cloak and is healed. Now, you might remember from back then that we reflected on the fact of how obviously she had been suffering physically tremendously for all these years, but her suffering was not just physical, it was also emotional, but also spiritual, because she was unable to enter into the temple for worship because she was considered impure, as for laws given in Leviticus. So ultimately, ritual impurity or defilement, ritual impurity meant that somebody could not be in the presence of God. Even priests, if they did not go through the appropriate cleansing rituals before making sacrifice in the temple, would die. Now, if you're not familiar with these Old Testament laws, specifically around ritual impurity, just to be clear, we're not talking about sin here. This is not, no moral wrong has been considered to be perpetrated. For example, one other circumstance that would lead somebody to be considered impure or unclean or defiled was a woman after giving birth to a child. Right, that's no wrong or moral wrong has been committed, but a lot of the rules around impurity were around the loss of blood, and that would happen in giving the birth of a child, and loss of blood because blood represents life. Life is the penalty for sin, and so anything to do with loss of blood was considered ritually impure. So no moral sin had been committed here. Now, I have not yet figured out how all of these ritual impurity laws connect and why God described them that way. But I think what's important about the subject of ritual impurity is that, firstly, it's not sin, not the same category. All sin, by the way, you would be considered impure and not able to enter the presence of God, but not all defilement was because of sin. You with me? That's one thing. Other thing to know about ritual impurity is that it was transferable. So if you came into contact with a person who was considered ritually unclean, you too became unclean. Another category of people considered unclean, large category, 2 chapters in Leviticus, of people afflicted by leprosy. And you would know that therefore they had to shout out, unclean, unclean, so that people did not come into proximity with them and therefore be considered impure. So impurity was considered transferable. That's ultimately the reason why this oral law developed around the washing of hands. All of that to say, that's why the Pharisees had this particular commandment. Not that it was a commandment from God, but the logic of it went something like this. Perhaps in the going about of my day, I have come into contact with something or someone considered impure. I've touched it. Now the impurity is on my hands, and now touch my food. It's on the food, and I now ingest the food, and therefore into my inner being, I am now considered impure. So that was the logic going on here. I mean, it's fairly good logic, but not the commandment of God. So these Pharisees are challenging Jesus about the fact that he does not practice this ritual of washing hands before eating food, which is something in their minds. I mean, it's not a commandment of God, but it's something in their minds no serious religious teacher would ever consider breaking it. That's what they're challenging him with. This will become important later, but here is Jesus' response. So let's read that little part again. Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?" So just notice there, they're also not saying it's a commandment of God. They're saying it's a tradition of the elders. So why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders, the oral law, for they don't wash their hands when they eat? And he answered them, "And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" And so immediately Jesus goes beyond the thousands of man-made things and goes, "Why do you break the commandments of God?" Which is quite an exchange. He goes, "Oh, you think we break traditions of elders? You break commandments of God," which is a serious response to these Pharisees. You'll notice later the disciples come to Jesus and say, "Hey, do you realize the Pharisees are offended at what you're saying?" I think Jesus realizes that they're offended. There may be many reasons for that, but part of it is this: because they were scrupulous in their attention to keeping these thousands of traditions, just so that at least originally they did not break the commandments of God. And now Jesus is saying, you're breaking the commandments of God. In other words, it's like the kids jumping in the pool without even getting into the backyard, which is impossible. And I'm not sure if it means my metaphor is incorrect, or maybe just that's how it works. Because how is it possible that if your desire is to not break the commandments of God, you end up breaking them by keeping the tradition? Now, how were they doing this? So this is what he challenges them with. You're breaking the commandments of God. That's what you're trying to protect. You're breaking those, but you're sticking to traditions. How? Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this morning because we've got a lot to get through, but just so you understand what he's saying here, he picks up on one tradition, the part of the oral law, not a commandment, that had to do with dedicating anything in your possession to God. So you could do that. It was a thing you could do, a tradition, where one might say, I am going to dedicate my house to God. It's his, it now belongs to him, it no longer belongs to me, which sounds like a very worshipful thing to do, right? You dedicate it to God, but the way this rule, this man-made rule worked is you did not have to exchange the property, or if it was an amount of money or an object, you did not have to exchange it at that time. The money could only change hands at a much later stage. So again, on the outside, this seems like, man, holy people would do something like this, but turns out that they were using it as a loophole. And the way people were using it as a loophole was a way of avoiding giving to people in need, especially their parents. So caring for parents in their old age is like a big deal in almost every culture, I'm sure, in Jewish culture and in the scriptures. And the way this seemed to have worked is this tradition, parents would be in need, and children, instead of helping their parents in need, would say, sorry, this house we have or this savings account we've built up, can't give it to you, we've given it to God, sorry. But then they would go back on that vow and still live in the house and still live with interest of the bank account, etc. In other words, their vow really was, they were not actually dedicating something to God, they were just avoiding someone else getting this stuff. You with me? This is how they were practicing it. And Jesus says, so you're breaking the fifth commandment, which says honor your parents. So you're breaking that, but you're keeping this man-made tradition. And so in so doing, with this little example, he does two things. One, he exposes the real issue, which is their hearts. Because they are not dedicating these possessions out of a desire to worship. Actually, it's selfishness. They just don't want to help. They want to keep their possessions. So the dedication, the vow, has nothing to do with worship, but selfishness. So he goes there. He's going to go to the selfishness that's in their hearts. But beyond that, there's a hypocrisy issue. Because it is selfishness, but under the guise of selflessness. So on the outside, it looks amazing. They're sacrificing, giving that, all of that to God. Well done. But on the inside, it's actually not selflessness. It's selfishness. The tradition is just a pretense, external piety or religion just masking inner rottenness, which is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is something we've come across a few times already in Matthew. Hypocrisy that exists especially in a religious context. So in the Sermon on the Mount, when the word hypocrite is used, Jesus speaks of those who like to pray loudly on street corners. The problem is not praying, or maybe the problem is not even praying loudly. The problem is praying loudly in order to be seen by men. Jesus says that. Really, the outward piousness of praying it's got nothing to do with worshiping God. It's got just wanting people to think I'm a religious person. He says the same thing about giving to the temple. Those who, when they give money to the temple, make a big show about it. Everybody, I'm about to put in a ton of money. And Jesus said the problem is not that they give to the temple. They should, but they do it in order to receive praise from men and not from God. That's hypocrisy. Come across this before, but here it comes up again. Jesus calls these religious people hypocrites. By the way, he's going to escalate that. Chapter 23, he's going to go nuts on the charge of hypocrisy with the religious community. But here he quotes Isaiah. So this is Isaiah. He says, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." So here, that's just a great summary of what hypocrisy is. The lips are saying nice things about God, but the heart is far from God. Now, Isaiah was saying it to people then. Jesus was saying it to people much, much later. So that means this must be a common problem, especially in religious communities. Saying things or performing religious rituals where the heart is far from God. And Jesus says, or he quotes Isaiah saying, and applies it to the Pharisees, in vain do they worship me. In vain meaning, it literally means empty. There's no, absolute, it's useless. Their worship is useless. It has zero value. The little ritual has zero value, at least to God. And so the conclusion is this: going through religious motions is useless if the heart is not postured in the same direction. The problem is not the religious ritual. The problem is doing it with a heart that's nowhere near what the ritual is supposed to be exhibiting. So that's verse 1 to 9. This is Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees. He's going to turn his attention to the crowd, and we'll get there in a moment, and then to the disciples. But I don't want to move on from this too quickly. I mean, I do, because I really want to get to what's coming next. But I do think it's worth pausing for a minute here. This is something, it seems common to religious communities. We are a religious community. We go through religious rituals, a lot of them that are not commandments as exactly prescribed in the scriptures. Is it possible that we go through some religious motions when hearts are far from God? I say this to you, I know this is a little bit like a common preacher thing to say, but I mean this genuinely. If you're here today, it's unlikely that your heart is far from God. Now, I don't know that. It just seems to me, if you're coming to church on a Sunday, like there's many other things you could be doing. So if you're here, your heart is postured at least in some way to God. So maybe not at that extreme level, but maybe. But perhaps on a deeper level, what Jesus is getting to here, what these religious leaders were doing was substituting inner devotion with external ritual, believing the ritual is effective on its own. And I do want to bring that warning. Where we substitute pure inner devotion with external religious ritual and believe that's okay, that's enough. But Jesus would say, and Messiah would say, it is useless. What matters most is not the ritual, but the heart. Are you with me? And that's where he's going. The text is going deeply to matters of the human heart. So let's see, Jesus shifts now to the crowd. So he's dealt with the religious leaders, he calls the crowd. This is what he says. And he called the people to him, and he said to them, hear and understand. Meaning, pay attention, this is important. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person. That's all he says to the crowd, which seems like very cryptic, right? It is. It seems like a parable. It is. Peter will say to Jesus later, hey, explain that parable to us. So it's cryptic, as parables are, but as with all parables, you should be able to discern at least the main point. And the main point seems to be this: impurity, or that which leads a person to not be able to get into the presence of God. Impurity is not something contagious transmitted from the outside world to the inside of a human heart, and definitely not through consumption of food that has been touched. Do you see that? Just let's try to be all on the same page here. The main point seems to be defilement is not something that is transferred from the outside by accident to the inside of a human heart. I mean, that's the context. Washing hands to make sure that defilement doesn't come from the outside inside, right? What Jesus is saying is that religious defilement, please hear this, it's the whole point. Defilement, what truly means we cannot be in the presence of God now or eternally. Defilement resides on the inside. At least hear that. It lives on the inside. That's where it starts. It manifests itself. It starts on the inside. It manifests itself through the mouth. And he's using the mouth because of the food thing. So, if, for example, through words, but also through behavior, which he'll go into later. This is the main point. You see it? Defilement is not something transferred from the outside in. It's already on the inside and it works its way outside. Now, what that means is immediately you can see this is a much bigger problem than a problem of washing hands or not. Because it's not defilement, it's not something you can just casually contract through inadvertently touching something, but never mind, you can just wash it off with a little or a lot of water. Defilement is deeply internal, therefore much harder to reach, much harder to sort out. This is the parable Jesus tells. He turns his attention now to the disciples. Well, because the disciples come to him and do what we saw them do in chapter 13. Go, hey, please explain the parable to us. And he does, but before explaining, I feel important to just point this out. Before explaining, Jesus says to the disciples, are you also still without understanding? So the Pharisees are without understanding. As you guys, my disciples, do you still not get it too? Right, that's what he says. Which means what? It means that he thinks that by this time, his disciples would understand this principle. They would know that the deeper issues of life are not on the outside, but on the inside. They should know that. Question, church, how should they know that? Where have they encountered this kind of teaching from Jesus? And the answer is, because it was just the other day, which is a very, very long time ago, in the Sermon on the Mount, this was the underlying teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. The fact that the heart is the source of all unrighteousness. For example, just give you one, what Jesus said in Matthew 5, you've heard that it was said, in other words, this is written law, you shall not commit adultery. That's not man-made, that's from God. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I don't know if you remember back then, but that was kind of shocking to realize that, man, just the impulses of our hearts is of the same consequence spiritually as behavior. This was massive for us to realize that unrighteousness, according to Jesus, goes really, really deep. It starts on the inside and manifests in actions. So, we who've been studying Matthew diligently, we should be getting this. The disciples should be getting this, but we're slow, they're slow, and hopefully Jesus does explain things some more. So here is his explanation in verse 17. Do you not see, so aren't you aware, that whatever goes into the mouth, whatever you eat, passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. So question, he's elaborating a little bit on his parable, but how so? He's saying the same thing, but he is giving some extra detail, curiously, on the human digestive system. Right, he says there, hey, don't you know what goes into the mouth passes into the stomach, that's new, and is expelled, which is a euphemism, and it's Sunday, and we're in church, but you know what that means. In fact, if you were reading it in the Greek text, and I don't know why English translations don't include it, because the Greek text includes the words, and is expelled into the toilet. Like it's there. And I think for a reason. In other words, metaphorically speaking, whatever's harmful in food, man, your body just deals with it. If it's something that's not useful to the body, it has ways of digesting it and processing it. And whatever might be not useful for the body ends up in the sewer. But, he says, what proceeds out of the human heart defiles a person. Here's that word again. Defiles, makes them unable to be in the presence of God, and then goes into this list. And if you put those two things together, that what's not harmful about food gets expelled and into the toilet, but what comes out of a heart defiles the person, what you get is that what he's implying is that what comes out of a human heart is dirtier to God than what exists in a toilet. Now, we're putting things together here, and I don't want to be over dramatic because I'm a preacher and we do tend to do these things. I do want you to see this, like he's including these words as crass as it is, meaning the contents of a human heart are filthier before God than the contents of a sewer. And then he gives a list. It's not a comprehensive list. It's not the only things that what is considered that defilement. Interesting, in the list, 7 things he mentions, 5 of them occur in the 10 commandments. Again, this is just Jesus zeroing in always on, never mind the man-made traditions, what did God say? So 5 of the 7 things are from the 10 commandments. He also refers to issues that he already spoke about in the Sermon on the Mount, like murder and adultery. So we're supposed to be reminding ourselves that murder is not just a physical act of murder, it's anger. And adultery is not just the physical act of adultery, it's the lust of a heart. In other words, we all read this text, all of us. If you still feel like that doesn't apply to me, I'm okay. Then like the first item on the list, evil thoughts. I mean, I feel like no one's passing that test, right? So we all come out of this. I mean, this is so heavy for me, the realization that the human heart is filthy. The human heart is a sewer. And it's that sewer that overflows and creates a mess in our lives. And that's where the passage ends. So amen, thanks for coming to church today. See you all next week. I mean, we have to deal with, like, if I really wrestled with it, I was like, this is what I'm left with. What's the solution? And Matthew, we love Matthew, don't we? Because he's super organized and detailed, a nerd. But if I had to see Matthew one day, I'm like, man, I love your style. But like, what's up with leaving us hanging here? Because he does. But actually what Matthew would say to us was, actually, if you've been paying attention, you'll see some breadcrumbs to the solution. So we're going to get to a solution. So we have to. I can't leave you there. But before we get to solutions, I do want us to take some time to think about just how radical this teaching of Jesus, Matthew 15, verse 10 to 20, how radical this teaching is in our current context. Let me say some things that I'm really convinced about. Current, secular, and even Christian belief, if we're honest as Christians, if we're really honest, is that the source of all of our struggles, the source of all of our angst, is the word Sam Albury used last weekend, of all of our brokenness, what the secular world and most Christians deep down believe is the source of my issues is outside of me. Even when it comes to our own acknowledged sin, so me. Yes, I get angry. I get angry a lot on the road. I told you it's confession time today. You all can just forgive me. But I mean, what this would say is the only reason I get angry on the road is because all the other idiots on the road who do not stop at red robots drives me nuts, or take their turn at the robot. But you all have heard me vent about that enough, so enough of that. But I wouldn't struggle with anger if it wasn't for the other people around me, right? Or I would not have adulterous thoughts, or worse, adulterous actions, if it weren't for all of the pornography, all of the stuff going on our screens around us. Or maybe we might say things aren't going the way we want with our spouse, and so it's their fault. But ultimately, it's not me. It's because of things outside of me. And to take this further, we believe, and I think I say this with great conviction, not just because it sounds dramatic. Again, preachers do that. We have this belief that if we could externally, if we could rearrange the circumstances of our lives, if we could just fix some things around us, we'd be happy, thriving people. For example, if we could just find a way to earn more money, then we would be happier. Or if we could find a different country to live in that doesn't have load shedding, then we would be happier, thriving people. People go to enormous lengths to reorganize their lives, even leave the country, just because, and this is not always the case, but often the belief that external circumstances are the problem. And I can't thrive, I can't be happy because of the external circumstances. The problem's on the outside, is what we think. Now, listen, we're going to take a while here, but I'm not saying there's no such thing as external problems, and I'm not saying that those external things don't affect us. I spoke about this 2 weeks ago. And when Jesus speaks on adultery and lust, he does say, if your eye's causing you to sin, tear it out. That's not literal, you know that, right? But what he's saying is, yes, there are things that are before our eyes that are unhelpful. And so there are things that ferment the sewer inside of us, but ultimately, church, when you read Matthew 15, 10 to 20, when it comes to the source of our brokenness, the things that really rupture the fabric of our relationships and our society, again, not being dramatic, I mean adultery and murder, the things that really break us, the source is on the inside. So we think our problems are external, and the solution is rearranging the circumstances. We also think the problems are external, and perhaps the solution is internal. Now, here I'm talking about pop psychology today, which says things like follow your heart. Now, I do want you to really reflect on that. Some of you go, oh, no one really says that anymore. But again, if you think of the gender identity debate, just think of a lot of what modern psychology says today is if you can look deep enough, and you really go to your innermost being and at your deepest level, there's purity. And if you can find that purity, and if you can verbalize that instinct, that's going to be good. On the deepest level, this is the assumption, is that at the deepest level, if you can just find that and act it out, you will thrive. To which Jesus says, rubbish. Like he says, no, the problem, no, don't follow your heart. Don't. Because it's a sewer. And we have lots of warnings about this in the scriptures. The problem, church, is not external and the solution internal. The problem is internal. The solution is external, not through rearranging circumstances. There's another external solution. Do you want to know what it is? You know what it is. What's it? If you don't know the answer, Jesus. Now, I know that's the answer. I know you know the answer. But we're faced, man, as I was just thinking about this is my heart. Like, I know this about myself. I know enough about myself to go, this is true. Like, if you all had to see what's inside my heart, you'd be like, man, I ain't coming to this church no more. Like, I get this. And then we have a framework in our minds of Christianity, and we know. So Matthew doesn't tell us yet, but we know if you've been a Christian for a while, and if you don't know, this is some of the best stuff you'll ever hear in your life. What we know is that forgiveness, there is a gift of forgiveness on offer. Forgiveness literally here meaning cleansing, a way to turn that sewer into streams of beautiful fresh water. And that is through belief or faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. You can have that right now. You can pray that in your heart. You can say, my heart is a sewer. But because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, by believing in him, I have forgiveness. Guys, we're going to practice this a little bit later, and that's awesome. Christians know that. Christians also know that, like what the team led us with during the offering, create in me a clean heart, Psalm 51. We'll reflect on that later. Create in me a clean heart. Like that exists in the scripture, the idea that our hearts can be cleansed. We read over and over again, and the Spirit will give you a new heart. And so we live in long enough past Matthew to know that this forgiveness enables us for the Spirit to be resident in us and give us new hearts. So we know these things. But I want to stay in the bounds of Matthew. Do you want to see where in Matthew we have these ideas at this point? This is a bit of a exercise, but hopefully this will just land for us where I want to go today. So Matthew would say, brother, I've been trying to tell you that all along, but where? So we're talking here about religious defilement, right? The things that lead us to not be able to be in the presence of God. I already mentioned to you Old Testament laws around what a person would be considered impure if certain circumstances, like blood, leprosy, also coming into contact with a dead body. So Numbers 19 just says if you're walking into a tent, that's how it was back then, and somebody had died, no fault of your own, you became unclean through being in a tent. Now, I mentioned those three examples because in the story of Jesus so far in Matthew, do those ring any bells? I mean, I gave it away because the woman one I already mentioned. We know he encountered a woman who was ritually impure for 12 years. She touched him. What about leprosy? Have we come across stories of leprosy? Chapter 8, 2 men afflicted by leprosy who Jesus miraculously heals. We also came across a young girl who had died, and Jesus raises her to life. In all of those cases, we've reflected on this. We're like, wow, Jesus can heal. Amazing, rightly so. But now today, church, today, with ritual impurity in our minds, what we should be thinking is, hang on. If this is the case, transferable impurity, Jesus touches a woman who's impure, touches lepers, touches a girl who has died. We don't see him becoming impure, do we? We don't see him washing or offering sacrifice at the temple, do we? No, why? Simply this is what we know up to now in Matthew. When it comes to Jesus, and only when it comes to Jesus, impurity is not transferred. purity is transferred. Normally, when an impure and a pure person, when there's contact, both become impure. But with Jesus, when an impure and the pure of Jesus come into contact, both become pure. We've seen that. So I want to say to you, this is why we love Jesus, right? This is why we worship Jesus. This is why we believe in him. This is why we sing songs about being utterly devoted to him. Because only in him are these deepest sources of the deepest brokenness actually cleansed. And not just so that we can be forgiven, that actually we can change. Only in Jesus. And I want to just push this point and say, I don't know who all is out there, but I know there's been many people visiting and from very different backgrounds. And so if you come from other religious backgrounds, I need to tell you there's only one way to be cleansed, for the heart to be transformed. And it is only through Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Only he does that. And it's because, if you want to know why, how, not just because he's God, but because he will become ultimately the sacrifice. All of the other defilements required sacrifices, he becomes the one. And I'll leave you with that, Hebrews 9, which is why we'll reflect on in communion. It says, for the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons, that's our word, with the ashes of a heifer, those religious rituals, they sanctify for the purification of the flesh. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, how much more will that blood purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God, to be in the presence of the living God? Amen? Church, I want to encourage you, let's calm down. I speak about myself. But I'm not going to pray. Zwai's going to come up and lead us straight into communion. But let's just give ourselves a minute of silence to reflect on this before we participate by faith in these symbols of cleansing.